Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I just tried to fix the lighting and maybe it's not so great. Is that better? Okay. Excuse me. So we're gonna look at part one of Ancient Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Excuse me, I always say that, Louis Bonaparte. And this is the very famous opening lines. I've shortened it a little bit. History repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. And you should hear this line ringing with maybe some other cliche things you've heard about history. You know, that history repeats itself and that those who refuse to learn from it are condemned to repeat it. Or that Mark Twain added something to that. He sort of refined that idea. He said, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So there's similarity, but there isn't a direct repetition. That's a sort of way of mixing the two predominant ways we see time. This is according to Gould, who we're also reading, as either an arrow or as a cycle, repeating, and the way of combining the two, Twain does very elegantly there. He says it doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So there's difference and similarity over time. And then Marx is telling you that rhyme at the end, that rhyme in the repetition has like the structure of a joke or a punchline. The rhyme comes at the end and it makes you laugh, or it makes you despair, like many liberals and people interested in education or just anything refined at all were despairing when Donald Trump was elected. Okay. And the notion that's repeating over time in this text is what we call Bonapartism. That is this military dictatorship based on nostalgia and resentment of rural conservative peasants, which we're not quite there with Trump. He was elected, although he didn't win the popular vote and so on, and he isn't quite a dictator yet. Although I wouldn't put it past him to dispute the results of any election that doesn't go the way he wants it to. But in some ways, man, it's getting pretty close. Okay, and those peasants today are not so much. And this is recurred in other places too. Hitler is considered Bonapartist. It's a precursor to what is called fascism or Nazism. Okay, these are conservative right-wing philosophy. Right-wing philosophy is basically the idea that there's that order, rank, class, hierarchy in society with people on top with all the power, the rich getting richer, the poor, that's natural. That's how God intended it. Or if they aren't so religious, that's how capitalism, which is also considered natural, and this idea of social Darwinism is at the forefront of that sort of thinking is there. So it's a precursor to Nazism and fascism. What it lacks that Trump and the Nazis and all those people make much great, and I'm not saying Trump is a Nazi, I'm just saying it's a difference of degree, but it's a crucial amount of degree. He's not killing anybody, although he is running concentration camps. They scapegoat. So the Jews are to blame in Hitler's Germany. The Mexicans are to blame in Trump's America. Neither group is to blame. Why it's a precursor is there's no notion of no scapegoat yet. Without a scapegoat. Precursor fascism comes without a scapegoat in Bonapartism. And it had quite a staying power. Marx underestimated it. Anyways, let's look at the beginning of the text. And again, when I read from Marx, I want you to just have a sense that Marx is a damn good writer. And these are maybe some of the most famous lines he ever wrote. They were, again, initially published as articles in the New York International Tribune, defunct newspaper now, but he wrote as a foreign correspondent for this liberal progressive paper in New York in the 1840s and 50s. And he maintained that position and wrote a lot of his best work there, if you ask me. So here he is at the beginning. Hegel remarks somewhere. I'm at the chapter Roman numeral 1 of the 18th Brumaire. I'm on the website. You can Google the website, Marxist.org, 18th Brumaire. It'll come up. There's 7 chapters. This is chapter Roman numeral chapter 1. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great historical facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. All great historical personages and facts appear twice. And Hegel's famous idea is that by in late Republican Rome and early Imperial Rome, they killed Caesar, Julius Caesar, to sort of prevent him from becoming too powerful. And by doing that, they brought about the idea of a Caesar as an emperor. That the name they killed the physical man, but they gave birth. He occurred twice. He then kept recurring as all these people calling themselves Caesar, meaning emperor by it. If you want other examples of this, often, again, things happening twice, great world historical facts. So Caesar happened twice. Historical facts happening twice. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, discovered simultaneously, as I discussed in the last series of lectures, by Darwin and his cousin, Alfred Lord Wallace. Wallace was younger and Darwin delayed by 20 years publishing, only published because it was becoming clear Wallace had the same theory worked out, basically. Not as well, but more or less. And that as a courtesy, because they were both gentlemen and family and stuff, Wallace let him publish first, and he rushed to write and complete The Origin of Species in 1859. Other examples of things recurring twice like this. People say the American, our country, the United States, has 2 foundings in 1776, and then the Second War of Independence, the rebirth of America, the second time, the Civil War. The Civil War is called the second founding of the United States on the equal footing for black people that was robbed of them, denied them hypocritically in the first founding of the country. And then, of course, all that was rolled back through legal shenanigans and corruption and nonsense and racism. And then there was a second. So there are these repetitions. Things happened twice. The liberation of blacks then happened again 100 years later in 1965. And I can go on with other things that repeat. Like one great example is in mathematics, and don't ask me too much about it because I don't know, the discovery, and probably some of you are in this class, you probably hating this example, but the discovery of infinitesimal and differential calculus, the field of mathematics called calculus, the discovery of that was made simultaneously and independently by Gottfried Leibniz and Isaac Newton. Newton's often credited mostly because of our parochial bias towards English-speaking people, and he was probably the greater genius of the two. But they were both strangely religious, and that's often forgotten about Newton. Leibniz, we use his notation system. So these things, so Hegel has a point. Who's Hegel? He's this great philosopher, kind of a crazy person, but very, very influential in the 19th century. He died in 1830. Marx encountered his work as a student. There was a group of liberal progressive students in Paris and in Germany called the Young Hegelians that Marx was a part of and then broke with. And Hegel's the one who gives Marx his philosophy of change that we call the dialectic. So in any case, he's here referring to Hegel, and Marx is sort of a repetition of Hegel, really. The fact of the dialectic, the reality of it, the power of that way of thinking, the greatness of it, as the sentence says, that all great world historical facts and persons appear, the fact of the greatness of the dialectic only becomes apparent when it happens again with Marx and Engels, making it materialistic, making it not about ideas unfolding over time, but about the reality of nature and the physical, biochemical, historical processes that we call the material world. Okay, that is where dialectics should be located. Anyways, going back to this quote, he forgot to add the first is tragedy, the second time as farce. Costadier for Danton, Louis Blanc for Robespierre, the Montaigne of 1848 to 1851 for the Montaigne of 1793 to 1795. The nephew for the uncle, that's Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte for his much greater uncle, the real Napoleon, and the same caricature occurs in the circumstances of the second edition of the 18th Brumaire. So this is a farce. The rise of power of this guy is a farce. People in that first sentence, Danton, Robespierre, the Montaigne of 1793 to 95, these guys are what we call the Jacobins. Famous socialist journal today called Jacobin. They're a political club. They ruled France during what we call the Reign of Terror. They are often maligned because they use the guillotine so swiftly and readily. They killed Louis XVI. They killed Marie Antoinette. Killed a bunch of the aristocracy. Went too far. Got themselves killed by the same measure. And then this reactionary period against the revolution on behalf of the people set in. That culminates in 1799 with Napoleon declaring himself emperor. The other people in those quotes, Costadier, Louis Blanc, the Montaigne. Montaigne meant, it was like a name for a clique in the parliament. They used to sit way up high, and so they were called the Mountain. And then these guys in 1848, when the Republic was reborn, it was like a second French Revolution. These guys called themselves that, but they were junk. They were nonsense. Okay, similarly, this is Louis Blanc and Costadier. They were no Danton. They were no Robespierre. No one feared them. They didn't cut anybody's heads off. They didn't whoop the rest of Europe's ass in a war when they were attacked. They were just chumps who were quietly swept away by the Party of Order, and then by the Party of Order was swept away by Napoleon III, by Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew. So, going on now, this next paragraph, beautiful paragraph. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So, and this speaks, people often say Marx thinks it's inevitable that the workers will take power, and that communism or socialism is the future. This is Nikolai Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, said this famously at the UN as a threat and also a sort of promise to the United States. He said, your grandchildren will be communists. We're going to bury you. Your grandchildren will be communists. So this is inevitable because there's so many more of the workers, and the merciless exploitation of them is bound to give rise to a revolt. But you see here, Marx is limiting things. He's saying, no. You don't, in the abstract, maybe that's true, but in the course of historical events, you find yourself thrown into a situation you don't control, and into a set of circumstances you don't choose. Like, for example, a lot of people are saying today who supported Bernie Sanders, if only, this crisis with the coronavirus had hit now that Bernie's out of power, but if only there was a left-wing liberal government right now. It's like the crisis that would allow transformation of the economy to sustainable energy, to favoring the common good, to helping people cancel debt and stuff. And that crisis that could allow for all those things is happening too soon, before there's like a new Obama or Biden or whoever it is that will actually work on people's behalf. Not that I think Biden will. But for it to happen under Trump is like a cruel joke, because the people running the government now are the same people who, by legal and extra legal ways, totally exploited and took advantage of the last crisis to make money. Who illegally, like for example, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, foreclosed on all these homes and stuff. So history has a way of not agreeing with the will that we want to impose on it. Okay, that's the idea here. And listen to what he says now about tradition. The tradition of all dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Tradition is a nightmare that we are constantly experiencing. It's not rational. It's not scientific. It's not something good for a revolutionary like Marx. It's something that's a nightmare or equivalent to one. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from their names, battle slogans, and costumes, in order to present this new scene in world history in the time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Thus, Luther put on the mask of the Apostle Paul. That is, Martin Luther repeated himself farcically as Saint Paul, the Apostle Paul. The Revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternatively in the guise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And the Revolution of 1848, the one he's now discussing, knew nothing better than to parody, now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793-95. In the like manner, the beginner who has learned a new language always translates it back into his mother language, but he assimilates the spirit of the new language and expresses himself freely in it only when he moves in it without recalling the old, and when he forgets his native tongue. Let's not worry about that too much, but go back to just the overall point he's making here at the beginning. History repeats itself, first as a tragedy, then as a farce. The tragedy here is the revolutionary period in French society from 1789, which is still celebrated as the founding of modern France. July 14th, Bastille Day is this important event in 1789 that signaled the beginning of the revolution, and that's like National Independence Day in France. And then it ends in 1815. That's this tragic series of events where there is a revolution. They do abolish slavery. They do give people ordinary people rights. They do win against all odds when fighting all these other monarchical governments that come to attack them, including England, Spain, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Brussels, and basically all of Europe. They beat them all in battle, heroically. The left then loses power because it's infighting too much, and it becomes weakened, and the right takes over, and that leads to this dictatorship of Napoleon. And that becomes an empire after the short-lived republic that is defeated only in 1815, and that restores the old monarchy, but not for long, okay, and never really again. Monarchy is an anachronism at this point. Although there are some very potent, powerful monarchs in the world, they're not the dynamic leading countries of the world anymore, at least for now. So that's the tragedy, that 1789 to 1815 period. The farce is what Marx is now reporting on, 1848 to 1851, when this French Revolution happens, and in 3 short years, first the workers are defeated, then the Republican bourgeoisie are defeated by their own mishandling of events, and then the monarchist party, the party of order, they are defeated because they've outlawed the right to vote for most people. They're infighting with each other. They all fall to the mighty, but not so mighty because he's a ridiculous failure before this, Louis Bonaparte. Louis Bonaparte had tried to do a coup in 1836 and again in 1840. He'd failed both times. He was basically not considered a legitimate son of the aristocracy on Napoleon's side. The Orleanists, he had no money, he had none of their capital. He was always in debt. He was mostly concerned about his salary. I mean, it's like Trump, really. He's mostly just concerned about the salary and how he's going to get paid and make money out of the fact that he was in power. That's what it seemed like to them. But eventually he's cunning enough that he seizes the moment and takes power in a tradition that's a scary reactionary one that is become a sort of facet with fascism and Nazism, and then today with right-wing populism in America and elsewhere in the world, where there's this rural peasant, rural small landholder, car dealership owners kind of people, that their resentments and attitudes dictate how they're who's represented by these reactionary figures today. All right, so coming back at you with one other video about Marx and then a couple on Gould. Okay, peace.